Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Burns, I'd like to throw out a few things and ask you to comment on them. Obviously, I'm concerned, all three of you are concerned about the damaging impact about these cuts will have on our national security. So let me ask you these things. Firstly, Vladimir Putin just attacked the American democracy and has been undermining our European allies for years. We need to resist the Kremlin's campaign to destabilize the West. How will these cuts impact our ability to help our allies respond to President Putin's dangerous influence in their countries?
Mr. Engel, if these cuts are instituted, if they're implemented, if the State Department and aid take a 31% overall cut over the next couple of years, the only place to cut in the State Department is personnel. We don't have battleships. We don't have big bases that we put into mothballs in the interest of budget austerity. And I have been through lots of budget cutting. It always cuts people. We're a very small corps. The Foreign Service is essentially 2 heavy brigades. So ultimately, Putin's going to be a priority, obviously, containing Putin in Eastern Europe. I think that'll be well served by any administration, but I worry that other necessities will not be. Colombia, for instance, which is just winding up a good period of a peace accord. Are we going to maintain the faith that we've had since the Clinton administration through Republicans and Democrats on aid there? And so you're going to have to make some very cruel choices. The State Department is not big. As Bob Gates said when he was Secretary of Defense, there are about as many members of the armed forces marching bands as there are American diplomats. That puts it in perspective. So that's why one reason I worry about the future of our great Foreign Service. It will be demonstrably smaller, and then we won't have the resources we need to protect our interests.
Let me ask you this, Ambassador. ISIS is getting weaker. Its territory has been shrinking. Secretary Tillerson has discussed a 3-step plan to defeat ISIS, a military campaign, a transition phase, and a stability program. And Secretary Mattis has made clear that his strategy to defeat ISIS requires a strong partnership with the State Department. So what would these cuts mean for stabilizing Iraq and Syria after the defeat of ISIS?
It gets to this issue that some people, in justifying these budget cuts, says we're going to withdraw from these conflict zones. Even if there is a ceasefire tomorrow, and there won't be in Syria, you'd really need the State Department to go in. Not as much DOD. We're not going to put major American forces on the ground to help stabilize, to negotiate a ceasefire, to begin working with some new entity in Syria. The U.S. Global Leadership Council actually pinpoints this question and says that part of what the State Department and aid have been doing over the long term is to engage in programs that try to strike at the roots of terrorism and delegitimize the terrorist groups themselves. And those programs are at risk if this budget is put forth.
Let me ask you this one. The danger of climate change for the United States is crystal clear. In my view, unfortunately, President Trump's announcing plans today to decimate President Obama's Clean Power Plan. But as we look around the world, we see coastal cities which could be enveloped by the sea in a decade or two, famine deepening in already drought-stricken climates, and populations on the move, destabilizing key countries. How will steep cuts to American diplomacy and foreign assistance make us less safe by taking away our ability to make regions threatened by climate change more resilient?
This, I think, is one of the most worrisome aspects of this budget, because climate is being targeted in the budget, not just the EPA, but also research, and particularly U.S. funding for research through the United Nations, which is playing the central organizing role. And I certainly accept the science. I think the climate change agreement, the Paris Agreement, was one of President Obama's great achievements, and one of the great achievements of American diplomacy over the last many decades. We now have commitments. If we don't meet those commitments, or as is rumored, if there's a debate in the White House that somehow we might even pull out of the Paris Accords, it's going to fundamentally affect not just the climate science and diplomacy, but it'll affect American credibility. If you go to, I know you all travel, you go to many parts of the world, climate is the #1 issue. You go to Europe, it's the #1 issue of the populations, not just the politicians. So if the largest economy, second leading carbon emitter says we're no longer going to be part of this, there's going to be a dramatic reduction in American credibility.
Thank you. And finally, let me ask this question, any of the witnesses who might want to comment on it. Last week, the New York Times published an op-ed entitled, "The Real Threat to National Security, Deadly Disease." The office provide just a sampling of the substantial infectious threats we currently face: the H7N9 bird flu spreading in China, a potential yellow fever outbreak in Brazil, and the rise of antibiotic-resistant infections that could become a greater threat than cancer within our lifetimes. So I ask unanimous consent that the article be included in the record. In the midst of these threats, the administration intends to slash funding for the State Department, USAID, and the National Institutes of Health, all of which defend Americans against diseases before they reach our shores and provide us with the tools needed to protect ourselves when they eventually do. So the question I have for any of you is, would it be fair to say that the cuts included in the President's budget make us more vulnerable to international disease threats? Can you speak broadly as to what the human and economic repercussions of these cuts might be, particularly for the American people?
No, I did read the op-ed. I thought it was exactly correct. There have been 400 diseases since 1940 that have jumped from animals to humans. What we need to do is have an effective monitoring system, which, for instance, the Nigerians did have, which enabled them to deal with the potential Ebola outbreak effectively. So at a minimum, we need to have budget support to have monitoring in places where these diseases might arise, which are mainly in tropical areas and in less developed countries.
And this budget would take that support away.
It would.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. We know